and offer the opportunity for people, both our students and the public, to engage in local, state, national, and international dialogue. So we're glad you're with us. Take a look at the flyer at your place to see the upcoming programs that we have for the month of April. We'll be announcing the May schedule very shortly. To introduce our speaker this morning is one of our students. It's my pleasure to present him to you. Octave Ellis is a native of Metairie, Louisiana. He is a graduate of Xavier University and received his master's degree in science and public health from Tulane. This summer, for his international public service project, he will be working in Ghana. Would you please welcome Octave Ellis.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Our speaker for this morning is the best-selling author of The Trouble with Islam Today, a Muslim's call for reform in her faith. The New York Times has described her as Osama bin Laden's worst nightmare. She takes this as a compliment. Irshad Manji is a scholar, lecturer, journalist, and filmmaker. She is currently a senior fellow with the European Foundation for Democracy. She is also a social entrepreneur and has launched an initiative to develop the world's most inclusive leadership network of reform-minded Muslims. It's called Project Ijtihad. Last week, 60 Minutes aired the story of a young terrorist in Britain who's been reformed by Project Ijtihad. He is now working with Irshad to transform other angry and vulnerable young Muslims. That's how inclusive her leadership network is. This is an example of the power her message has. As a journalist, Irshad's columns are distributed worldwide by the New York Times syndicate. But print is not her only medium. On April 19th, Irshad will debut her latest project, a documentary film about reconciling Islam with freedom. It is entitled Faith Without Fear, and it will premiere on PBS, so stay tuned. For her work, Irshad has been recognized by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. Ms. Magazine named her a feminist for the 21st century, and Immigration Equality gave her its Global Vision Prize. Irshad has also been recognized by none other than Oprah Winfrey, who awarded her the first annual Chutzpah Award for audacity, nerve, boldness, and conviction. She has also been recognized by the Jakarta Post in Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country, which identifies Irshad as one of 3 Muslim women creating positive change in Islam today. All of the above recognition results from her belief in her message. When did we stop thinking? A chapter heading in her book that sums up the challenge her message presents to Muslims, Christians, people of all religions, men and women, humanity in general. Her message is one that some find offensive yet need to hear, and others readily embrace, because if accepted, it can free those whose mind is bound and bring hope to the distraught. Irshad's message of independent thinking is rooted in her understanding of Islam's own tradition of independent thinking and critical reasoning, ijtihad. So as you open your minds and ready your thoughts, please join me in welcoming Irshad Manji.
I have to say, I've been called a sellout, but today it's for the right reasons. This is an amazing crowd. Thank you very much for showing up, and hello to all of you up there as well. Good morning, or afternoon, as the case may be now. Salaam alaikum. Shalom. And to the atheists out there, how the hell are you? You know you're out there. That's okay by me. I also have to say, as a proud Canadian, je suis très fière d'être ici avec vous dans la Petite Roche. And what that means is, I'm proud to be here with all of you in Little Rock. Now, I say it this way because I know that the name Little Rock actually comes from its French version first, La Petite Roche. And this is my small but significant tribute to tradition. As a faithful Muslim, tradition means a whole lot to me. But tradition not for the sake of merely preserving it. Tradition for the sake of finding the best spirit in it, and then applying that best spirit to contemporary circumstances. And as you'll see in the course of my remarks this afternoon, that is the spirit in which I appear here today. And as I deliver my remarks, what I really aim to do is tell all of you a very different story about Islam. Different than the one you're going to get from mainstream media, but also different from the one you're going to get from mainstream Muslims. And I hope, ultimately, to be presenting you with an idea that is big enough to change the world for good. All in 25 minutes. So let's get on with it. In order to get to that point, I first have to share with you a bit of my own story. My family and I are refugees from Idi Amin's Uganda, small country in East Africa. We settled just outside of Vancouver, Canada in 1972, and I grew up attending two types of schools. The regular, secular public school of most North American children, and then on top of that, every Saturday for several hours at a stretch, the Islamic religious school, known as the madrasa. And that is where I regularly imbibed two major messages: that women are inferior, and that the Jews are treacherous, not to be trusted. Now, in each one of these cases, I asked the question, why? And in each case, I received such theoretical answers that they seemed completely disconnected from the reality on the ground. For example, my madrasa teacher would tell us that the Jews worship Wallah, not Allah, meaning money, not God, that they're all consumed with business. Really, I thought, that's odd, because I looked around my multiracial, multicultural suburb just south of Vancouver, and I noticed something very interesting. All of the new business signs being put out were in languages like Japanese, and Korean, and Hindi, and Punjabi, Cantonese, Mandarin, Urdu, which is a language spoken in Pakistan and large parts of India. In other words, Asian languages. Not Yiddish, not Hebrew, Asian languages. I thought to myself, maybe it's not the Jews who are consumed with business. Maybe it's us, Asians. And that proved to be a moment of moral reckoning for me, because it sparked probably the most important question of my entire life. I think it's an important question for all of us. What if I'm not being educated at my school? What if I'm being indoctrinated? Crucial distinction, isn't it? Education versus indoctrination. Education encourages critical thinking. Indoctrination squelches critical thinking. And that question seeped into my skin, into my conscience, and into my professional life, such that it drives everything that I now do as a journalist, including the book that has brought me to the attention of the Clinton School for Public Service. A a book entitled The Trouble with Islam Today, a Muslim's Call for Reform in Her Faith. Now, what do I mean by the trouble with Islam today? In a word, I mean literalism. Literalism. An uncritical, unthinking, unquestioning approach to the faith. An approach that turns faith into dogma. You see, ladies and gentlemen, faith is secure enough to handle questions. Faith never needs to be threatened by questions. Dogma, on the other hand, is brittle and rigid and always needs to be threatened by questions. And I want to acknowledge, apropos of what you heard our future president say, that every religion has its share of literalists. Every. American Christianity has its evangelicals, some of whom still populate the White House. That was not, no, that was absolutely not meant to be a jab, it was merely an observation. Jews have their ultra-Orthodox. In fact, a number of ultra-Orthodox Jews threatened the lives of gay and lesbian activists in Jerusalem last year when they held their World Pride Parade. Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists, for God's sakes, have their fundamentalists. Now, don't ask me how that one works. That may be another book for another author, and if I may inject some cheap Buddhist humor, for another lifetime. I warned you, it was cheap. But to get ultra serious now, the difference, I would argue, is that only within Islam today is literalism mainstream worldwide. And let me explain what I mean by that rather loaded statement. We Muslims, even here in America, are routinely raised to believe that because the Quran, Islam's holy book, was revealed after the Torah and the Bible, it is the final and therefore perfect manifesto of God's will. Okay? Not given to the ambiguities and inconsistencies and outright contradictions and, God forbid, human editing like all of those other so-called sacred texts. No. This is very important for all of us to understand. Even moderate Muslims believe, as an article of faith, that the Quran is not like any other holy book. It is, if I can put it this way, God 3.0 and none shall come after it. Now this, no matter how you slice it, folks, is a supremacy complex about the Quran. And this supremacy complex is dangerous for a couple of reasons. First, it disproportionately empowers the radical fringe in my faith, the violent jihadists. And notice I call them a fringe. That they are. But they have a disproportionate amount of power. And how does this supremacy complex empower them? In the second reason that it's dangerous. This supremacy complex inhibits the reasonable center, the moderates, from asking questions about what happens when faith becomes dogma. You see, the violent jihadists are so expert at quoting from the Quran to justify their violence. And because the rest of us have been taught that we cannot question the perfect Quran, we're left with the queasy feeling that challenging those who quote from the Quran is to challenge the Quran itself. And that is supposed to be a no-no. Well, I'm here to say that in fact it is permissible to ask questions, even of the Quran. And no, not because spiky-haired, Western-raised feminist Irshad tells you so. Not at all. But because Islamic tradition tells us so. Welcome to the big idea that has the capacity to change the world for good. And Octave, to his credit, pronounced it beautifully. This idea is called ijtihad. Ijtihad. It's Islam's own tradition of independent thinking. And I'm going to spell that for all of you because sometimes I find it's easier to wrap your head around a new word when you can visualize it. I-J-T-I-H-A-D. T-I-H-A-D. Ijtihad. Now I want to acknowledge that this word sounds uncomfortably like jihad to many non-Arab ears. And in fact, it comes from the same root, meaning to struggle. But unlike any notion of violent struggle, ijtihad is all about struggling with the mind to comprehend the wider world. It is, again, Islam's own tradition of critical thinking, independent reasoning, debate, and dissent. And far from being theory, ijtihad has a solid track record. You know, in the early centuries of Islam, thanks to the spirit of ijtihad, 135 schools of interpretation flourished. In Muslim Spain, scholars would teach their students to abandon, quote, expert opinion about the Quran if their own conversations would, get this, the ambiguous Quran, not the perfect Quran, not the straightforward Quran, the ambiguous Quran, came up with better evidence for their peaceful ideas. And in Cordoba, one of the most sophisticated cities in Muslim Spain, there were 70 libraries. 70. Now that rivals the number of libraries in most cosmopolitan cities today. Well, Islam had this 1,000 years ago. In fact, so much of what we in this part of the world assume is the product of Judeo-Christian culture or secular European culture was in fact shaped by believing Muslims. Let me just give you a quick partial list because I think you all will find it interesting. Muslims gave the world among the first institutions of higher learning. It was known as the House of Wisdom, and it sprang up in 9th century Baghdad. Muslims gave the world, you're gonna love this, mocha coffee. You're welcome, Starbucks. Believing Muslims gave the world an early version of the guitar, and even gave the world that ultra-Spanish expression, ole, which has its root in the Arabic word, anybody? Once again? Allah, exactly right, Allah, which of course is Arabic for God. And on that note, I have a quick, I think funny story to tell, but I promise it'll be quick. I was speaking, actually lecturing at Yale University this time last year as a fellow there, and I threw this factoid out to the Ivy League students assembled. What Arabic word can you imagine the Spanish word ole stemming from? Dead silence. I said, all right, I'll throw you guys a scrap. I turn my head heavenward, and I whisper, ole. More dead silence. This time punctuated by the shifting of bums and seats. I said, all right, I'm going to kick it up a notch and give you one more hit. I drop to my knees and I yell, ole! And a student at the back of the hall yells back, oil! As the Chinese proverb goes, you know you live in interesting times when the word oil can be considered Arabic for starters, and secondly, possibly the Arabic word for God itself. But I won't push the analogy much further. Back to the topic at hand. You know, what I find so constructive about emphasizing ijtihad is that I'm not asking my fellow Muslims to import a foreign tradition or an alien virtue into the faith. Not at all. People like me, and I'm not the only one who's saying this, I assure you. In fact, I've got a paper here that I'd like to give out to anybody who's interested, written by a Muslim scholar about ijtihad being so key to the development of Muslims even during the golden age of Islam. People like me, the ijtihadists as I call them, are reminding our fellow Muslims that Islam itself once exuded this glorious, progressive, pluralistic tradition. It kind of reminds me of something, and I don't want to be gratuitous in saying this, Smith, but it does remind me of of something that President Clinton himself pointed out about America in his 1993 inaugural address. He said, "There is nothing wrong with America today that cannot be corrected." Actually, he said that cannot be cured by what has always been right with America. I'm saying the same about Islam. There is nothing the trouble with Islam today that cannot be corrected by what has always been right about Islam, namely this tradition of independent living. But we're not satisfied as reform-minded Muslims with merely talking about it. We've got to revive the tradition of ijtihad, and we've got to popularize it, democratize it, so that even ordinary Muslims see that it is their right and their responsibility to think critically. And the way to revive ijtihad, I believe, is deceptively simple. Deceptively simple. It is to ask questions out loud. In his intro, the octave mentioned a young terrorist, now ex-terrorist, from Britain, who has been transformed by the concept of ijtihad. He himself had been growing doubts about the legitimacy of what he was being ordered to participate in. And he began asking questions and realized that his handlers didn't have the answers that played to his mind. They had only the answers that preyed on his prejudices. And in recognizing that, this young man left the jihadi network. But I'm now not going to just tell you why I believe the approach of asking questions is worth experimenting with. I'm going to show you. This afternoon, I have brought with me a short video clip, 7 minutes long. It's part of an on-camera interview that I conducted with the leader of Islamic Jihad in Gaza. Now, just so we're on the same page, Islamic Jihad is one of the groups in the Palestinian territories that is fighting the occupation through suicide bombings. And before we roll that clip, let me just share 2 quick points with you. The first is that you will hear the Islamic Jihad leader responding to me in Arabic. Don't tune out at that point because the English translator jumps in very quickly so you'll understand exactly what this guy is saying to me. And the second point to make is that if you guys need a few moments to just adjust your ears to the audio, let me give you a running start. The very first question I ask in this clip is, where does it suggest in the Quran that you can kill yourself for a higher cause? I remind the Islamic Jihad leader that the Quran is pretty explicit that suicide is morally wrong. So what is it that I'm missing when the likes of Islamic Jihad justify, rationalize suicide bombings by quoting me from it? And with that in mind, I'll say one final thing. Feel free to laugh at any point in this video. To kill the interview at that point. Which is actually okay too, because it's a better option than him killing me at that point. And that's exactly what the translator whispered to me would happen if we didn't get out of there fast. Now, in fact, I don't know, I mean, I can't expect you guys to pick up on the really small things, but there was one point in that interview where my voice skipped and went really high because he was kicking me under the table not to ask this line of questioning. I didn't listen. Anyway, as I was packing up and hurrying out of Dr. Al-Hindi's office, I managed to squeeze in a final question. Why would Al-Hindi give me an interview on camera, knowing that he couldn't back up his most basic claims? And I asked this of the translator, and he replied without any hesitation, because he figured you were just another dumb Western journalist. And I asked him to explain that as we were, again, piling into his car. He said, look, Al-Hindi has done no shortage of interviews with Western correspondents, including many, many American reporters. But this is the first time that he's actually been challenged to corroborate his statements with evidence. Everybody else has taken him at face value because he's the expert. And that's what I mean about the power of asking questions to bust monopolies on truth. Ladies and gentlemen, I want all of us in this hall today, whether you are Muslim or non-Muslim, to understand it is not just your right, it is your responsibility to ask questions. When it comes to religion, and especially when it comes to other people's religions, we're not asking enough questions. I know why, out of a fear of offending, out of a misguided notion of respect for the other, or for religion in general, or for God in particular. Out of a naive belief that there will always be somebody else who asks those questions, so we don't have to. The problem with those arguments is that when you pile them up, they amount to deadly silences. Silences that help perpetuate atrocities in God's glory. And today, as I stand here speaking to you, it is even more imperative than it was 72 hours ago to feel the permission to ask questions out loud. What happened this past Friday is that the United Nations brand new Human Rights Council adopted a resolution opposed to the, quote, defamation of religion, which in actuality is the defamation of Islam, because that is the religion that the resolution focuses on. It was sponsored by Pakistan on behalf of the 56-member body known as the Organization of Islamic Conference. This is a worldwide union of Muslim countries. And what this resolution does is it quashes the few remaining rights that Muslim dissidents have in Islamic countries to openly critique their religion. This resolution allows both authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes in the Islamic world to take those rights away in the guise of international law. Well, you and I still live in a part of the world where we have the freedoms to think and express and challenge and be challenged without fear of government retaliation for doing so. All the more important then that we ask the important questions. We can't leave it up to our media, as you just saw, right? Journalists, myself included, have too many deadline-driven excuses not to ask all the pertinent questions. And Lord knows we can't leave it up to our governments to ask all the pertinent questions, even in a democracy. After all, democracies impose upon their participants the very special burden of getting reelected. So moral cowardice will always be a stock in trade for many, many politicians in a democracy. That is why we as citizens have got to get comfortable asking questions out loud. And when we do, when more of us do, I believe we will finally have the wherewithal to tackle what I would call the great dilemma of the early 21st century. And that too can be summed up in one question. How can open societies, multicultural societies produce pluralists, people who appreciate many perspectives and truths without producing relativists? People who will fall for anything because they stand for nothing. I leave you with that question, and now, in the spirit of each jihad, I welcome yours. Thank you very much.
Let's give her another round of applause. We have a few moments for questions. We have two people with mics there. If you turn to your either left or right and see. We'll ask maybe 2 or 3, 4 or 5 questions. Your question should be no more than 30 seconds. If it's longer than 30 seconds, it's not a question. All right? So let's keep them short and precise. Here we go.
We enjoyed your speech very much, and recently we had Reza Islam here as well. He spoke of Reformation as you do. How do you see people your age and younger moving toward a large movement for Reformation, not just in America, but all over?
Thank you very much for that question. If you didn't hear it on this side of the room, the question is, how do I see people my age and younger playing a role in the Reformation of Islam, not just from America, but indeed around the world? I think that we are the key. This emerging generation truly is the key, and I say that for a couple of reasons. I know you want to get a global perspective, and I'll give you that in a second. But I can also tell you that many younger Muslims from America are recognizing the precious freedoms that they have in this country that their parents certainly didn't have in their home countries, and are using those freedoms, for example, to start campaigns to crash local mosques, insist on their right as women to sit on the men's side of the mosque, and when they are being threatened with being booted out or worse, to remind the people who run the mosque that the Prophet Muhammad didn't put up walls between men and women in his time. Why should you? This is happening here in America. Also in America, a couple of years ago, a professor of Islam, another woman, led the first mixed gender, very important, mixed gender prayer on a Friday in Islamic history. And it happened out of none other than New York City, ground zero of America. She got so much flack for it that no less a figure than Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, denounced her. What a badge of honor. You know, that what is happening with the chutzpah, the audacity of many young Muslims from this part of the world is being noticed in the traditional Islamic world, which brings me to the Islamic world. I have a great little story to tell you. You know, immediately after my book came out, because of the burst of international press that it received, my email inbox overflowed with messages from young Muslims in the Middle East appealing to me to get the book translated into Arabic so that I could share, or they could share, I should say, these ideas with their friends. And my standard, totally unimaginative response to them was, please, name one Arab publisher that'll have the guts to translate, let alone distribute this book. And most of these kids wrote back to say, you're right, but so what? You get the book translated into Arabic. You then post that translation on your website. And when we can download it, free of charge, as a PDF, that means we can read it in privacy and therefore safety, something we wouldn't have if we were carrying a physical copy of the book around with us. And that in turn means, Irshad, we will create the opportunities to have these debates with our peers. I love their logic. Took their advice, got the book translated and posted. In only a year, about 200,000 downloads so far, and counting. And you know, I can tell you who's actually reading this, and I'll wrap up my answer with this quick point up here, which is that about this time last year, I was in Cairo, Egypt, and I was amazed by how many young Muslim men, and not just women, approached me to say, thank you for getting your book translated and posting it online and making it accessible to us. Not only am I reading it, but my friends are too, and it's now making the rounds of the democracy. So this is part of the global interdependence that President Clinton always talks about and brings.
Back in the time.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
From the global Islamic world, what would be the question that Islam would ask of Christianity?
The question is, from the global Islamic world, by which I think you mean the traditional Islamic world, what would be the question, the overarching question that Muslims would have for Christianity? I'm going to lob that ball back in your court, sir, because that is such an unusual question that it's clearly coming from an interesting place for you. Tell me what you think the answer would be.
With 30 seconds.
Notice that my answer to him was even less than that.
I asked the question the other day in relationship to Christianity and the history it has of producing the Ku Klux Klan in the South, the torturers in South Africa, the history of torture coming out of the United States now in response to 9/11, and saying what is the fundamental question we need to be asking of Christianity because of this image. And I think that question is, what are we doing and what's our religion causing us to be doing this in the name of Christianity?
Well, you know, that is a question that is very much, again, rooted in a willingness on the part of Christians to look deep into themselves, to engage in introspection and say, we've got trouble within our own religion too. It ain't just Islam. And I have to tell you something, sir, and I realize, by the way, that not every, in fact, many Christians don't share your perspective, so I want to acknowledge that. But here's the bigger point that I want to acknowledge. The very fact that you can stand up in this hall as a citizen of the U.S. South and ask a question like that and then explain that really we Christians have to look deep into our souls too, that is the kind of introspection, unprompted by me, that I would love to see Muslims engage in. Just once, I would love to be somewhere where a Muslim, and I mean this with the greatest of respect, of an older generation, stands up and says, you know, Irshad, it's true that there's liberalism in all the religions, but really, we Muslims have got to stop pointing fingers at the other religions and start taking ownership, or at least sharing ownership, for what we are contributing to the crisis in Islam today. This is what you have just done on behalf of Christians. And I'm working for the day when Muslims will do the same. Thank you for 7 minutes.
Great job.
Could you speak to the impact of the poor economy in the Arabic world and how that affects Islamic extremism?
It's a great question. What is the impact of economic poverty in the Islamic world as it relates to the rise of fundamentalism? I think it's huge. But I don't think that's all there is, of course, to the answer of what makes anybody a fundamentalist. After all, we need only look at the economic means from which most of the 9/11 hijackers came. They were at the very least upper middle class, if not quite wealthy, their families were. But that does not negate the fact that poverty deepens the problem. You know, we all remember the riots over the Danish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, again, about this time last year. And when those cartoons were planted in poor parts of the Islamic world, it was very easy for the authoritarian governments in those parts of the world to distract attention away from the illiteracy, away from the poverty, and focus it on this, you know, massive insult that the West had yet again slapped the world of Islam with. The people don't have jobs to go to. When they don't have those kinds of responsibilities to attend to, it is easy to bring them out in massive numbers to protest against distractions. So that, you know, certainly is a key part of the problem. I'm going to wrap up by being more constructive than what I've just said and suggesting what part of the solution may be. In chapter 7 of my book, which is entitled Operation Ijtihad, again, Ijtihad being Islam's own tradition of critical thinking, I outline a global and non-violent campaign to liberate the entrepreneurial talents of women in the Muslim world. Why women? Because there is consensus within Islam that when a woman earns her own assets, she gets to keep 100% of those assets and do with them as she sees fit. So here's the idea. Why not all of the rich countries around the world, the United States included, my own Canada included, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, etc., why don't we all take just a sliver, I didn't even mean a slice, just a sliver of our defense budgets and pool them into a coherent program of microcredit loans for the women of the Muslim world, okay? And what could they do with those loans? They could, of course, start their own businesses and fill gaping holes of goods and services in their towns and in their villages. And with that money, become literate. Learn to read the Quran for themselves and see all of the passages that they will never be told, by the way, by the mullahs and the imams about. See all of the passages that it gives them for self-respect. And then also start their own schools, which in fact is happening in some parts of Kabul today. And I'll finish up by showing you how this actually can work on the ground. This is not mere fantasy. About 6 months ago, I received a call from a good friend of mine, a photojournalist in Kabul. And she said, Irshad, remember those progressive verses of the Quran that you identified in your works? She said, I met a Muslim woman who took a microcredit loan from a non-governmental organization, started her own candle making business, became literate, found those verses that you're talking about, and here's the kicker, recited those verses back to her husband, who was illiterate, and who has been beating her ever since they got married. And when he realized that those verses are in the Holy Quran itself, verses that he, of course, would have never been told about by his mosque or his madrasa, he has not laid an unwanted finger on her since. The question is, can this idea be scaled up? I believe the answer is yes. That has been proven time and again, even by President Clinton's own microcredit initiatives. The bigger question then is, where is the political will to make this happen? Absolutely.
We're going to take 2 more questions.
Okay, I totally concur with the main theme. The ijtihad is central Muslim tradition. Does it not make it the strength of Islam as opposed to trouble with Islam that you're suggesting?
Well, the question is, given how much you focus on ijtihad, is that not the strength of Islam rather than the trouble with Islam? Well, sure, but here's the thing, sir. The reason, I knew I had to first call the book The Trouble with Islam, which I subsequently revised to The Trouble with Islam Today, in order to acknowledge what I've already written in the book, which is that Islam was not this narrow and this insular, during its golden age. The reason I had to call it that was first because you and I both know that there are millions of people, hundreds of millions of people around the world who want to try to understand with big hearts and open minds why atrocities are being committed in the name of Islam. To have called it, as other authors, by the way, have since written books called What is Right with Islam in reaction to my own, and that's great. The whole point here is to create conversations. But to have called it What is Right with Islam today would, I believe, have been to completely overlook the searing and basic question that hundreds of millions of people have. I needed, for the sake of my own integrity, to point out that there is trouble within Islam today. And I think that we Muslims have got to get more comfortable with acknowledging that. And by virtue of writing a book like this, let me assure you, and I sort of made that point back there, but I'm going to say it again even more clearly. I am not for a minute suggesting that there is no trouble within Christianity. Not for a minute am I implying that there is no trouble within Judaism. The difference is we Muslims have got a lot of catching up to do in the dissent department. There are plenty of books about the trouble with Christianity and Judaism. Very few like this. And the whole point then is in fact to show that one can be self-critical and faithful at the same time.
We have 1 more question.
The question is, this thing about catching up to that you're talking about. I've read articles where some of the major American media, like the Washington Post, have cited, take the position that Osama bin Laden and so on are really extremists, hijacked just the religion for their own purposes, and that actually mainstream Islam can reconcile with other religions. I've also read that that unlike the other handful of major religions in the world that have learned to coexist and respect other points of view, Islam you've got to kill the infidel. Could you give us some perspective on that debate?
On that debate, yeah. Basically, the debate is, is Islam compatible with peace and pluralism and tolerance, or not? And I know where I stand on that. As a faithful Muslim, I remain within the faith, not because I feel that I have no choice. I absolutely do have the choice to leave it, at least here in this part of the world. but I remain within the faith precisely because I do believe that Islam has the raw materials to be humane and thoughtful and reasonable. Some would argue, therefore, as you alluded, that what has really happened is that Islam has been hijacked by the extremists. I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I've always rejected the metaphor of Islam being hijacked because that suggests that Islam is like a plane that prior to 9/11 was cruising to some human rights haven. And were it not for those nasty 19 terrorists on September 11, 2001, this plane called Islam would have reached its wondrous destination with nearly a lump. That's simply not true. More Muslims in the last 100 years have been killed by other Muslims than by any foreign imperial power. We've got serious issues within Islam, never mind with the West. So ultimately, where I stand is that the Quran, Islam's scripture, contains more than enough passages to not just allow us, but in fact encourage us to realize a vision of tolerance and acceptance of the other. The problem is us Muslims. Okay? Islam began as a religion of justice. It's been corrupted into an ideology of fear. More often than not, it is we Muslims who have done this to our own religion, and therefore it is we Muslims who must take the lead in fixing it. Unless anybody here believe that this is an un-Islamic message or an anti-Islamic message to promote, let me humbly disagree. There's a beautiful verse in the Quran, chapter 13, verse 11, which states, God does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. This is a call to clean out our house before we start building yours. Consider it a 1311 kind of solution to a 9/11 kind of problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's get to a